I am sitting on the living room floor tonight, my back against the couch, the lamp turned low, the rest of the house quiet in that way. Only nighttime knows how to be quiet. And there is a small blue sock in my hand that I should have thrown away 2 years ago, but never did. Because even now, at 23, I still cannot bring myself to believe that loving someone so completely can end without warning, without explanation, without mercy. And if you are listening to me right now, I need you to understand something before I say anything else. I was not ready to be a mother at 19, but I was ready to love my child with everything I had. And that love did not disappear the day I buried him, even if the world expected it to. People talk about motherhood like it is something you step into gently, like a soft pool you wade into ankle first, then knee-deep, then all the way. But for me, it was a wave that hit without asking, knocked the air out of my lungs, and dragged me into a version of myself I did not recognize, yet somehow already knew. And I remember the exact moment my life split into a before and an after, because I was standing in a cramped bathroom, my college apartment, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, staring at a thin pink line on a plastic stick, my hands shaking so badly, I had to sit down on the edge of the tub. Because at 19, you think you understand consequences, but you don't, not really, not until one is staring back at you in silence. I was 19 years old, a sophomore in college, working part-time at a coffee shop, still calling my mom when I didn't know how to cook chicken all the way through, still believing that adulthood was something that arrived gradually, politely, but there it was, demanding everything at once. And my first feeling was not joy or fear or excitement. It was disbelief, followed closely by a hollow, dizzy panic that made the room feel smaller, like the walls were leaning in to listen. The father was someone I thought I loved at the time, or maybe I loved the idea of not being alone, of being chosen, of being grown. And that distinction matters more than you realize when you're young. Because when I told him, his face went pale, his mouth opened and closed like he was searching for the right words in a language he didn't speak. And what he finally said was, "Are you sure it's mine?" And something inside me broke so quietly, I didn't even realize it had happened until years later. I went home that weekend, sat at my parents' kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I couldn't drink, and told them. And my mother cried the kind of cry that isn't loud, but carries decades of fear and hope and disappointment all tangled together. And my father went silent, staring at the wood grain of the table like it might offer him instructions on how to fix this. And I remember thinking, selfishly, childishly, that I wanted someone to tell me what to do, because suddenly, everyone was looking at me like I was supposed to know. I considered everything, every option people whisper about, every path that promises an easier life. But every time I imagined a future without this child, my chest felt like it was caving in, like I was erasing something sacred before it had the chance to exist. And maybe that sounds dramatic, but motherhood doesn't arrive logically. It arrives viscerally, and somewhere between the nausea and the sleepless nights and the fear, love rooted itself in me so deeply it terrified me. Pregnancy at 19 is a strange kind of loneliness, because people either judge you openly or avoid the topic entirely. And friends who used to talk about spring break and internships suddenly don't know what to say to you anymore, and your body becomes public property. Everyone has an opinion, a warning, a statistic. And I learned very quickly that being young and pregnant meant becoming invisible as a person and hypervisible as a cautionary tale. I dropped out of school halfway through my sophomore year, packed my things into boxes, and moved back into my childhood bedroom, the same room with posters on the walls and trophies on the shelves, except now there was a crib in the corner and prenatal vitamins on the dresser, and I felt like I was living two lives at once. The girl I had been and the woman I was being forced to become overnight. I worked until my feet swelled and my back ached, saved every dollar, read parenting books late into the night, and whispered apologies to my stomach for every mistake I was already afraid I would make. And when labor came, it came fast and brutal. Nothing like the movies, nothing poetic about it, just pain and sweat and fear, and a moment where I genuinely thought I might not survive it. But then they placed him on my chest. He was small and warm and impossibly real, his fingers curling around mine, like he already knew me, like he had been waiting. And I cried so hard the nurse laughed gently and told me to breathe. And in that moment, I understood something no one had ever been able to explain to me before. Love is not gradual. It is immediate and absolute. and it rewrites you without permission. I named him Noah. He had my eyes and his father's dimple. And the first night I brought him home, I sat on the edge of my bed, watching his chest rise and fall, terrified that if I blinked too long something terrible would happen. Because suddenly the world felt sharp and dangerous, and I had something fragile and irreplaceable to protect. Motherhood was harder than anything I had ever done, and also the only thing that had ever made sense. And I learned how to function on 3 hours of sleep, how to soothe cries that sounded the same to everyone else, but different to me, how to stretch a dollar until it nearly snapped. And there were days I cried in the shower, so Noah wouldn't hear me. But there were also mornings when he laughed for the first time, when he reached for me, when he fell asleep on my chest. And I felt like maybe, just maybe, I hadn't ruined my life. I had simply changed it. I was 21 when everything went wrong. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in the cruel way tragedies often are, the kind of day you never expect to remember forever. And Noah had been running a fever the night before. Nothing alarming, just enough to make him clingy, just enough for me to keep him home from daycare. And I remember thinking, we'd go to the pediatrician if it didn't break by noon. I never made that appointment. I found him in his crib that afternoon, too still, too quiet, and the scream that tore out of me didn't sound human. And the rest of that day exists in fragments. Sirens, hands pulling me back, voices saying words like unexpected and unpreventable. And we did everything we could. And I remember collapsing on the hospital floor, clutching my chest like I could hold my heart together with my hands. Sudden infant death syndrome. 3 words that mean nothing until they mean everything. I was 21 years old, and my child was gone. The days after are blurry, like the world wrapped itself in cotton to soften the blow. And people brought casseroles and spoke in whispers, and told me I was strong. But I didn't feel strong. I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped me clean from the inside. And the silence in my apartment was unbearable, because silence used to mean peace, and now it meant absence. I packed his toys into boxes I couldn't seal shut. I slept on the floor beside his empty crib. I wore his shirts to bed because they still smelled like him. And somewhere in the middle of the grief, something else crept in: guilt, the kind that doesn't respond to logic, that doesn't care about doctors' explanations or statistics, the kind that whispers at 3 in the morning that if you had checked sooner, loved harder, stayed awake longer, maybe your child would still be alive. I stopped answering texts. I stopped leaving the house. I stopped being 21. The funeral happened 3 days later, and I remember standing in the front row of a small chapel that smelled like flowers and furniture polish, staring at a casket that was far too small, thinking there had to be a mistake, because coffins were meant for old people, for people who had lived long enough to earn goodbye speeches and photo slideshows, not for toddlers who still mispronounced words and slept with stuffed animals tucked under their chins. I wore a black dress I had bought years earlier for a party, and it felt wrong in every way. Too tight in the chest, too short in the memories it carried, and people lined up to hug me, to tell me how sorry they were, how strong I was, how lucky Noah had been to have me as a mother. And I nodded and thanked them, because that is what you do when your insides are shattered. You perform normalcy, so no one has to sit with your pain too long. His father stood across the room, hands in his pockets, eyes red, and we didn't speak much after that day. Because grief either binds people together or exposes how little foundation there was to begin with. And hours crumbled quietly, without drama, without closure, until one day he stopped calling and I didn't have the strength to chase him. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life, not because of the crying. I cried constantly, but because of the moments I didn't cry, the moments when I laughed at something on TV or forgot, just for a second, that my child was gone. And the guilt of those moments hit harder than the grief itself, because it felt like betrayal, like proof that I didn't deserve to call myself a mother anymore. I avoided places that reminded me of him. I avoided mothers with strollers. I avoided mirrors. At 21, my friends were graduating, getting engaged, posting photos of road trips and new apartments, and I was learning how to survive days without a reason to get out of bed, how to sit in silence without losing my mind, how to breathe through a pain that never really left, only changed shape. There were nights I lay on the floor of my living room, staring at the ceiling, whispering his name like a prayer, like maybe if I said it enough times, the universe would answer, would explain itself, would give me something other than, sometimes these things just happen. Therapy came later, reluctantly. So did faith, in small, fragile pieces. I didn't suddenly become hopeful or healed, but I learned how to speak my grief out loud instead of letting it rot inside me. Learned that loving a child who died didn't mean my life had to end too, even if part of me wished it had. Learned that grief is not something you conquer, it is something you carry. I am 23 now. I am sitting at home tonight, on the same couch where Noah once climbed into my lap with sticky fingers and bedtime stories. And the house is quiet again, but it is a different kind of quiet than before. Not empty, not accusing, just still. There are photos of him on the wall. I stopped hiding them. There is a small box in the corner with his favorite things, and I no longer feel the urge to open it every day. But I don't want to forget how it feels to miss him either, because missing him means he mattered, and he mattered more than anything. People still tell me I'm young. They say I have my whole life ahead of me. They say I'll be okay, and maybe I will be. But what they don't always understand is that motherhood didn't end when my child died. It changed. It transformed into memory, into love without a physical place to land, into a quiet strength I didn't know I was capable of. I was 19 when I became a mother, and I learned responsibility, sacrifice, and love faster than most people my age ever will. I was 21 when I lost my child, and I learned that life can be cruel without reason, that loss does not wait for permission, and that surviving something unimaginable does not make you fearless. It makes you honest. And now, at 23, I am learning something else. That joy and grief can exist in the same body. That healing does not mean forgetting. That loving deeply, even briefly, is never a mistake. If you are listening to this and you have lost someone, especially a child, I want you to know this. You are not weak for still hurting. You are not broken because you survived. And you are not alone in the quiet moments when the world expects you to have moved on. I don't know what my future looks like. I don't know if I will have another child someday. But I do know this. Being Noah's mother, even for a short time, shaped who I am forever. And no amount of time, silence, or loss can take that away from me. I didn't just lose a child. I gained a love that will live in me for the rest of my life. And somehow, heartbreak and all, that love is still worth everything.